Welcome to the Korea Pro podcast. I'm your host, Jeongmin Kim, the editorial director of Korea Pro.
And I'm John Lee, the editor of Korea Pro.
Join us for a weekly 15-minute conversation as we dive into the most pressing stories shaping South Korea and dissect the most complicated ones for you.
From politics to culture, technology to society, we've got you covered. So stay ahead of the curve and never be sidelined again.
So get ready for a fresh perspective on South Korea's news. This is the Korea Pro podcast. Welcome to this Korea Pro special briefing about today's ruling. It's been a long day that removed former President Yoon Suk-yeol from office. I'm Jeongmin Kim. I'm editorial director at Korea Pro, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on what has been undoubtedly one of the most consequential constitutional rulings in South Korean democratic history. And this event is brought to you by Korea Risk Group, producer of Korea Pro. And our company does not work off outside funding, including any government funding, so we do not do ads or sponsorship to maintain neutrality. And so we operate purely through subscription. And if you're not a subscriber yet, consider visiting signup.koreapro.org to see possible subscription options. And our weekly podcast is free, so search Korea Pro Podcast in all major podcast platforms to get weekly 15-minute updates. And now, seeing more attendees are online, I will kick off with some of the main top-line findings that I saw from on the ground today. Just hours ago at 11:22 a.m. Korea time, the Constitutional Court unanimously voted to uphold former President Yoon Suk-yeol's impeachment, formally removing him from office. And this makes him the second South Korean president to be removed through impeachment. And this means there will be a snap presidential election reportedly around June 3rd. And before we start the discussion, I will summarize what exactly happened today at the Constitutional Court. This comes after the court's most extensive deliberation period process in an presidential impeachment case, during which they conducted two preliminary sessions and 11 hearings, including Yoon's final defense in late February and questioned 16 witnesses. The final hearing had included Yoon's 67-minute defense statement, where he faulted the opposition for obstructing governance through strings of impeachments and budget cuts and stating their actions constituted the true threat to the constitutional order, his words. And today I was at the Constitutional Court since around 7 a.m. There was massive police fences with the forces prepared fully for contingency with full riot gears. But largely it was very civil, at least near the court. And afterward, I saw pro-impeachment citizens celebrating, dancing, and chanting as Yoon supporters gathered not in Anguk, but in front of his residence, angry and quite disappointed. And the court's ruling was, despite various conjectures about a split ruling, quite decisive, and it was very comprehensive. All 8 justices, they unanimously agreed that Yoon violated the Constitution and the law when he declared martial law on December 3rd. And they largely accepted all 5 grounds for impeachment put forward by the National Assembly and rejected the veracity, the justifiability, and also the plausibility of Yoon's defenses. They structured the evaluation around the specific grounds for impeachment that National Assembly put forward, and then determined whether these violations were sufficiently grave to warrant a removal. So it was like a 2-part sort of remarks from the justices. The first one was the declaration of the martial law without constitutional justification. The court found that Yoon violated both substantive requirements, which is no genuinely justifiable national emergency, and also procedural requirements like proper cabinet consultation and failure to countersign and lack of proper notification to the National Assembly. They also rejected Yoon's what he called a warning or appeal type of martial law as having no legal basis in the Martial Law Act or the Constitution. And importantly, they emphasized that the brief duration of the martial law that Yoon initially stated in his defense was not due to his restraint, but rather was only possible due to, I quote, due to public resistance and the passive execution of duties by the military and the police, and hence it does not mitigate the seriousness of the respondents' legal violations. The second one was the deployment of military forces against the National Assembly. The court largely acknowledged the witness testimonies that the soldiers forcibly entered the National Assembly with explicit orders to break down the doors and remove the people inside. And they say that this violated lawmakers' rights to deliberate and vote, and also their immunity from arrest, infringing on freedom of political party activities. Also, political neutrality of the armed forces. Third, issuance of martial law decree suspending democratic governments. This was by Park An-soo, the martial law commander, and they stated that by prohibiting activities of the National Assembly and the political parties, and also strikes, Yoon violated representative democracy and separation of powers principles. Fourth, unconstitutional search and seizure of National Election Commission. This was the most controversial bit within the far-right circles in South Korea. The justices said that the military forces were deployed to the NEC headquarters, which Yoon admitted that he ordered, where they restricted access and confiscated mobile phones and recorded computer systems, and that the court decided that this was a warrantless search and seizure violating due process. Fifth, attempted tracking of judicial figures for potential arrest. They agreed that there were attempts to determine locations of judicial figures, including former Supreme Court justices, for possible arrest. And this placed pressure on sitting justices and constituted infringement of judicial independence. And then they moved on to the assessment of how grave these actions were. The court basically concluded that these actions represented a rejection of popular sovereignty and democratic principles, especially by deploying military and police rather than working with existing apparatus, that it was an undermining constitutional institutions and also infringing on people's basic rights, not just the National Assembly, and that it was a grave betrayal of the trust of the sovereign people. The court also determined that the benefit of protecting the Constitution through removal largely outweighed the national cost of removing a sitting president. So this is a very brief rundown. The full verdict was 114 pages, I believe. We will not go through everything, but we will focus on what the justices said today at the court, which was around 20 minutes. And now, thank you for being so patient, Professor Mobrand and Professor Cho, to help us unpack the legal and political implications of this ruling. I'm very delighted to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have Professor Erik Mobrand joining from not in South Korea, but European time zone, at the Professor of Korean Studies at Seoul National University's Graduate School of International Studies. He is an expert on political transformation in Korea with particular focus on the interplay of informal power and formal institutions. I personally think this is particularly relevant with what happened in the past few months in Seoul. Previously, he served as Korea Policy Chair and Senior Political Scientist at the RAND Corporation and as a faculty member at the National University of Singapore. Erik, Professor Mobrand, thank you so much for joining us during this very critical moment and from different time zone. We're also joined by Professor Cho Hee-kyung from Hongik University's College of Law. Professor Cho's research spans international economic law, intellectual property and human rights and media law, and her work also bridges legal scholarships and global policy, and she aims to offer insight into how legal systems interact with today's most pressing international challenges. Professor Cho, I'm honored to have you with us today, and thank you for joining us very late night in South Korea, and also everyone who's joining us today in Seoul time. Let's move directly into the questions that I have prepared for our panelists. And I want to start with understanding the legal basis of the Constitutional Court's ruling today. Professor Cho, I'd like to start with you on the legal foundations of the ruling. It was a unanimous vote. There has been so many conjectures about this. Some people were saying it's going to be 6-2, 4-4, 7-1, and there were so many rumors among journalists last night. Could you explain why there was a delay and what the unanimous vote means when it comes to this ruling, first of all?
So, as you say, the decision has come much later than everybody expected. I think most watchers of the Constitutional Court, in fact, most of the people in South Korea were really expecting the decision to arrive within about 2 weeks period from the final hearing date, which was the 24th of February, because that's how long it took to deliver the verdict or the judgments in the two previous impeachment cases that we had with regard to former presidents Roh Moo-hyun and Park Geun-hye. And this was pretty much an open and shut case. If you just consider the legal aspects of whether Yoon should be impeached and removed from the office or not, because what he did on that night of 3rd of December last year was completely against constitutional principles, and it was in clear breach of the Martial Law Act. So it really came as a surprise to all of us when the court stayed silent and did not set a date to pronounce the judgment. And the longer the delay became, the more worried and nervous and anxious people became also. And so we can only really speculate about as to what happened and what caused the delay until and unless one of the justices, writes a memoir much further down the track. But reading the judgment itself, you can see between the lines what might have caused the delay and who was essentially responsible for the delay. So I think there are a number of factors, but a big factor was the Supreme Court judgment that was handed down with regard to the opposition party leader Lee Jae-myung on the 26th of March. Now, a lot of commentators actually said that some of the conservative justices of the Constitutional Court were actually waiting until the outcome in that decision to actually make a decision themselves. But I think more likely was actually the opposite case, because these justices on the Constitutional Court regard themselves as the highest arbiter of law within the land. And to a certain extent, that is true. And I think they were actually more wary of how the decision of the Constitutional Court might affect the Supreme Court decision. And so I think they wanted to delay the pronouncement of their decision until after 26th of March. And I think instrumental in that delay were the two conservative justices who actually also wrote a minority opinion with regard to the hearsay evidence. And so I think the idea was essentially to delay the announcement until after 26th of March, and possibly even up until 11th of April. But because of the pressure that was placed on the Constitutional Court through the National Assembly and also by the people who were demonstrating daily in front of the court, requesting for the court to actually hand down the judgment, they, I think they actually brought forward the date to 4th of April. So that, I believe, was the cause of the delay.
I see. That's very interesting, because the Seoul High Court decision on Lee was also a surprise in and of itself, because he was acquitted.
Supreme Court, not the Seoul High Court, but he has about 5 separate cases that he's going through. And this was actually a Supreme Court decision. So he had already been found guilty for an electoral offense in the trial court.
Oh, election law violation.
Yes,
case.
Exactly. And then he was found not guilty in the second, the appeal court. And he was facing the final judgment from the Supreme Court. And I think many conservative pundits and many of the ruling party members were actually expecting that he would be found guilty, which means that he wouldn't have been able to run as a presidential candidate in the upcoming snap election, which would be held if Yoon is impeached and removed from the office.
I see. But now he can run.
Yes, that's right.
And that actually leads me to ask the next question to you, Erik, Professor Mobrand. I was going to ask more questions about the ruling, but I'll get back to that. Speaking of political timeline-related decisions, looking at this from a sort of political system analysis perspective, what does this unanimous ruling tell us about their institutional role in Korea's democratic system in line with what Professor Cho just explained? She said that they regard themselves as the final arbiter. How do you interpret this?
Well, thanks. I defer to our legal expert on this matter in particular, and I would only echo the earlier comment that Professor Joe made about the uncertainty. And we've in the past 4 months we've had these waves of at first feeling quite confident that there would be the response to this egregious violation of the Constitution that was anticipated. And then we had a delay in the initial impeachment process that happened. And then there was another delay. And so there was a feeling of uncertainty getting into late December and through January. Then there was calm again, and then there was extended uncertainty. And so we have had this back and forth between uncertainty and calm over the last few months. And as of today, it looks that we have landed at another moment of calm and in a fortunate position that should head us back toward the right sort of stability. It's fortunate that we have this decision. As Professor Joe said, one can only speculate as to what was going on in the background.
With the public sentiment in South Korea, what was interesting when I look at the main three pollsters, NBS Gallup and Real Meter, some of them included this question about public trust of the Constitutional Court. Usually they only ask party or government related questions, but they sort of made this question a weekly thing. And I saw NBS, the latest NBS one showed that 44% will not accept the Constitutional Court's decision if it's not in line with what they believe in. And also the public trust question of the Constitutional Court, it was also pretty divided. Does this have something to do with either of the parties constantly including Constitutional Court decision into party political languages in the past few months?
Is there a question for me or Professor Mobrand?
Go ahead, Professor Joe. Why don't you take the lead on this
For both of you.
Sure. So, in fact, I think the delay actually really eroded public's trust in the Constitutional Court. Right at the beginning of the trial, I think there was a very high expectation that the Constitutional Court would do its job and deliver the right verdict quickly. But there has been such mudslinging and muckraking with regard to reputation of some of the justices that were appointed on the previous administration, or the Moon administration, and certainly very divisive tactics that were deployed by the ruling party, and also the fact that the acting president, both Han Duck-soo and Ma Yun-hyuk, failed to appoint three of the three justices that were nominated by the National Assembly, also led to division. But 44% saying that they would not accept the Constitutional Court ruling if it doesn't align with their beliefs, it seems rather high, and that might actually express some of the frustration that people might have felt. But it is certainly true that the erosion in these our fundamental democratic institutions have occurred since the declaration, the illegal declaration of martial law last year, and the aftermath until now.
Thank you, Erik. Did you want to add anything about the polls?
I think those are great points. I think one maybe should take them with a bit of a pinch of salt. Take these numbers. Pollsters were asking an interesting question. They're asking a bit of a loaded question if they're asking it that way. So I'm not sure how seriously I would take that. I would say that in the past few months, I've been really struck by the sense in which democracy is something that is defended or advanced by humans. It's not something that just happens or that institutions protect. We cannot, a lot of analysis by academics like me talks about institutions and talks about, economically advanced democracies do not fall apart, full stop. But what we have felt, I think what we have felt and what many people in Korea have felt is the extent to which the stability of a democracy or its entrenchment depends on the decisions and actions of particular human beings and how variable that can be. And I think that's what we have seen over the past 4 months. We've seen individuals and small groups that have made some very poor decisions, and we have seen other groups and parts of society that have stood up and responded extremely responsibly. But it's depended a lot, I think, on that human touch. That's something that I've reflected on in any case the past few months.
Thank you very much. I have this lingering question from reading the ruling today. They talk about the threshold of a president using emergency power. What constitutes a justification for it? And I do feel like many among our international audience today, especially from North America, perhaps may wonder how this compares to constitutional thresholds of a presidential power, including emergency powers in their own countries. How would you interpret why the court determined that that Yoon's justifications basically fell short of those thresholds? I'll go to you first, Professor Cho.
Because they simply didn't meet the legal requirements. He has to comply. Yes, certainly emergency powers are within the powers given to the president. And in fact, the president has very wide array of powers under our constitution, much wider than I would say any other sort of presidential system, perhaps excluding the French system, and possibly wider even than the US system. Although in the US, the Supreme Court's interpretation of what an official act of a president that could fall outside the purview of a judicial review has actually widened the scope recently, I think. But even though emergency powers are within the presidential powers, there are limits, and declaration of a martial law has to comply with the legal requirements and conditions that are set down both under the Constitution and under the Martial Law Act itself. The Martial Law Act has been very carefully crafted based on the experience of our past history. When the National Assembly, there have been numerous coups up until 1980, 1981, so 45 years ago, when the last martial law was declared. And so there are lots of safeguards that are built in. For example, actually giving the power to the National Assembly to lift the martial law through voting process, and the fact that a president, even when declaring martial law, cannot actually breach the protection that's given to the National Assembly from gathering and going through the process of making the request to lift the martial law and so forth and so forth. And Yoon basically did not observe neither the procedural requirements, so getting the proper consideration and approval from the State Council, the cabinet meeting. Neither did he give a proper notification to the National Assembly. And if you look at the decree order number 1 that he made, or he got the martial law commander to make under the martial law, it's completely illegal and unconstitutional. And he knew that himself as well. So that's why the court was, unhesitatingly saying that this is beyond the scope of emergency powers.
Professor Mobrand, did you want to add anything?
Not at this time.
All right. Let's move on to some of the specific claims that you made and how the justices responded. And like I mentioned, one of the most controversial and issue that really mobilized the conservative protesters in South Korea in the past few months was the National Election Commission issue. The ruling very explicitly addressed that claim from Yoon that the military deployment at the NEC was justified because of cybersecurity concerns, but the court said that was against the principle of getting the warrants first, basically. How do you think the court evaluated these witness testimonies so far, and what does it really tell us about how to address these election security related issues when it's sort of sent to the Constitutional Court and the public expects the Constitutional Court to figure out if an election rigging happened or not? Is it in their purview?
Okay, so I need to unpack your questions a little bit because there are a few different questions that are mixed in there together. So the question of the military being sent to the National Electoral Commission, that itself is completely outside the martial law powers, because under a martial law, the government can basically, or the martial law commander can take control of all administrative and judicial functions of the state, but you cannot touch legislative function. And that includes the National Electoral Commission, because that, that's part of that's not part of either the judicial or the administrative functions of the government. So they really did not have any proper authority to actually go and try to occupy the National Electoral Commission itself. And the claim was that they wanted to investigate fraudulent elections, but there have been already a number of investigations that had been taken, and that has found no evidence of election tampering or any hacking into the systems, nothing untoward that actually happened. And so the court was pointing out that there are other ways to actually investigate those claims, and not having to exercise martial law powers to do so.
Or send the military.
Or send the military. And you might recall there was actually a legal officer from the military who came and testified. It was a female officer who was one of the head of the legal team within the military, who was actually asked the question of, can we go and get basically take servers from the National Electoral Commission? And she said, no, you can't, because we don't have the power to do so, and you will be charged with illegal seizure and search and seizure if you do this. And she came to the National Assembly to make this provide this statement when there were hearings into what happened on that night. And so it wasn't as if the military didn't know it. It wasn't as if Yoon didn't know it. And so it was simply really just trying to provide an excuse for this illegal self-coup when there wasn't any.
Thank you for unpacking all of that. Sorry, my question was so mixed. Go ahead.
Sorry, I forgot the other part, which was the witness statements and how they assessed it. And in fact, that was one of the more unexpected issue that actually became, I think, a cause of contention or bone of contention within the Constitutional Court, because if you recall, 2 conservative judges actually issued a supplementary opinion with regard to that point. And they were basically saying that we need to have better rules with regard to whether to admit hearsay evidence, because their claim was that, we had 11 hearings before the Constitutional Court, but the court actually received much more voluminous testimonies that witnesses gave to the prosecution office when they were taken for questioning or presented themselves for questioning there. And so although these testimonies have been given to the prosecution office, the Criminal Procedure Act was amended back in 2022 to allow defendants to essentially have their evidence not be admitted before the court if they refuse to have it. And so a number of key witnesses, including the former defense minister Kim Yong-hyun and one of the special forces commander Kim Hyun-tae, basically denied what they said at the prosecution office when they were called to the constitutional court. And so there was this dispute about, whether these witnesses' testimonies should be accepted or not, because if they were not to be accepted, then the court might not be able to actually make out some of the facts in their findings to substantiate the case against Yoon. But in Park Geun-hye's case, in Roh Moo-hyun's case, and in other impeachment cases, the Constitutional Court has already established rules of evidence, and the standard of proof is not the same as in a criminal court case, because this is not a criminal case. This is a disciplinary hearing to decide whether a high-level public official should be removed from the office or not. And so you don't have to apply the same kind of standard. And it's very clear, the court rules say that you apply the evidentiary rules that are appropriate for a constitutional court hearing. And so that's how they dealt with that evidentiary issues.
That's very instructive. Thank you very much. Another part among what the justices said, I do want to ask Professor Mobrand, is that they did scold the National Assembly a little bit at the end. They did mention party politics a little bit. They noted that Yoon likely did feel a heavy sense of responsibility due to the opposition from the National Assembly and everything. It wasn't like court was like that justifies Yoon's action, but they mentioned it, saying also National Assembly's responsibility to be a little bit more cooperative when it comes to governance. How unusual do you think in the past few years the level of conflict between South Korea's executive branch and the legislative branch we saw compared to other years? Because we do have a lot of advanced questions sent in from the audiences about what DP did throughout the past few years, strings of impeachments, and how that actually applies to Yoon's logic of things.
Thanks for that question. I think when we have kind of foreign analysis that has in mind Western democracies and is looking at South Korea's legislative politics or at legislative executive relations, there can be surprise at some of the level of animosity. Why are people not getting along? How come there is not more bipartisan collegiality? And I think it's important to understand politics in context. That if one has the viewpoint that that sort of collegiality, that sort of getting along is fundamental in a democracy, well, it's because that is built on a certain very long history, on a long history of people who represent different forces in society, figuring out how to work out those differences in a public place. We have a very different history in South Korea. And I think we also have a moment where the parties are increasingly representing different things. This was not always the case in the past. And this is by and large a positive development. What one wants as a citizen in a democracy is to have options but that are actually distinct. And I think we have moved slowly over the past decade or so in that direction, where the Democratic Party, not wholly and not all of the time, is representing a very different agenda to what Yoon's party has represented. And so there are real things to have conflict over. And there are also legacies of very, very nasty tools from the government and from the ruling parties. And so if we have an opposition that is trying to express a real difference, that is concerned with making real reforms in government and in society, then I think we should not be surprised or discouraged when it comes out swinging sometimes. that would be some general remarks in response to that question.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
May I add to that?
Yes,
Because
please.
I know exactly which remarks by the court that you mean. It's in the sort of concluding part of that judgment. And the court was basically saying that it has to be acknowledged that Yoon might have felt in his mind that all this slew of impeachment by the National Assembly was really making him unable to carry out his job as a president, etc., etc., etc. And certainly it seemed like it was in a scolding tone, but I would bet you any money that that was actually reflecting the opinion of the minority justices, and the presiding justice and also the acting chief justice were really bending over backward to try to accommodate them. But you also have to, as Professor Mobrand said, look at it in context, because Yoon was not a career politician. This was the very first public office he held, and he has spent his career as a public prosecutor, most of his career. And so if you have a hammer, every problem you see is going to be a nail. And he did not treat the opposition party as a political party to communicate with, to discuss problems with, to try to find solutions together. He even refused to meet with the leader of the opposition party until well into his presidency. Over 20 months went by without him ever meeting Lee. It might not have been as long as that, but certainly it was more than a year. And he didn't even attend the opening of the National Assembly both times. And so there was certainly no willingness on part of Yoon to try to actually cooperate or try to persuade the other side to come to some sort of, policy agreements, etc. And certainly it's been a very confrontational kind of a political situation. But as the court pointed out, these are political problems and political issues that need political solutions, and certainly not, a solution through declaration of martial law illegally.
Yeah, and they stated that pretty explicitly in the conclusion as well. And that leads me to my last question during the moderated discussion. I do want to open questions to the floor. Social polarization. Do you think that might have been one of the factors when the justices were deciding on the timing and the exact language in the ruling today? Because there has been a lot of developments in the past few months, including the vandalization of the court properties at the Seoul Seobu court earlier. And also the police, like I mentioned, they were fully prepared for contingency situation in front of the court and also in front of the Hannam residence of the president. What do you think was the court's intention to resolve the social polarization or to mitigate the impact when they were deciding on the timing and the content? I will ask this question to both of you.
So certainly the court, the fact that they really tried very hard to deliver a unanimous verdict is an indication that they were trying not to exacerbate the divisiveness that is existing within our society. Unfortunately, Yoon's government did nothing to help heal the division within our society, and I think what is the root cause of the divisiveness. There are many various factors, but it certainly started since very noticeably since the impeachment of Park Geun-hye, and the conservative supporters feeling very much as if they have been abandoned. And within the Conservative Party itself, the reason why they have taken the stance that they have done with regard to Yoon's impeachment is because they were concerned that the same thing might happen to them after Park Geun-hye's impeachment. And Yoon was certainly a leader who was much more divisive than someone who was bringing people together, because he was essentially getting his support from very particular groups within the society and not actually trying to widen his support base. And it played better to his political core support group to be divisive rather than to be inclusive. And it was certainly exacerbated through the leadership that we had in the last couple of years. But what gave me a little bit of hope is because my concern was that there would be a real violence and rioting after the announcement of the judgment. But as you say, most of the Yoon supporters were actually gathered around Hannam-dong, where the presidential residence is. And actually half of them, or more than half of them, just left the scene after the judgment was pronounced, rather than staying. And so the storming of the Western District Court was a real shock to all of us, because never in our history, with all of the violence in the struggle on both sides, did we actually have a direct attack on a courthouse. And that really showed the extent of incitement that impacted the people. And I think we really need to hold people who actually led that kind of incitement. I have a few figures in mind, accountable for their actions in starting that. But we certainly have the seeds of, I think, modern fascism shown in our society. And it's going to take a lot of effort and time to heal that divisiveness.
Thank you very much. Erik, did you want to say something about social polarization?
Yeah, thanks. So I think I cannot say something intelligent about the motivations of the court, but maybe I can expand a little bit on what Professor Cho was saying about the kind of the political sector leading the deepening of division. Maybe I'll expand on that theme and take it a little bit further. I think we need to be cautious in even characterizing South Korea as a polarized society. I think this framing is far too easy. I think it is very tempting, especially for foreign media, for those who are trying to communicate a story about South Korea to audiences outside. It's an easy story to tell because it's one that is seen in other Western societies. They have division, they have politicians going at each other, they have people on the streets with opposing banners. They also have polarization. I think that that is one reason why that frame tends to be adopted. I think it is also dangerous because it naturalizes something that is a political process. Just because it looks like there are politicians who claim they're representing different parts of society doesn't mean that there are these underlying deep differences. And to the extent that these deep differences exist today, it's because they have been played up and exacerbated by very particular individual politicians and small groups around them. And so I think Professor Joe pointed to this whole period since the Candlelight movement 8-9 years ago as a time when the far right has taken new shape, and there have been kind of layers of development within this. The most recent layer dates back to 4 or 5 years ago with the empowerment of a very fringe group of young men who are frustrated with women. They were a fringe group that would not say anti-women things in general in public. A particular politician gave voice to that and attempted deliberately to normalize that. Yoon was elected in part because he took the risk to embrace that movement, right? So we have very particular politicians endorsing positions that were once not normal and make a bid to normalize them. So my sense is that actually we can be more optimistic in some ways. I think South Korea is not actually that polarized. I think there are some shared beliefs across much of Korean society, but there are small segments that become on one side that become very, very noisy.
So the latter might be something South Korea sort of has to work on, going forward. And we are getting more questions, so I will now go to some of the audience questions. The first one from Justin Melzak: did the April 2nd by-elections factor into the ruling delay, i.e. not wanting to influence voters in those processes? I think this relates to what you mentioned, Professor Cho, about the March ruling that might have impacted the decision timing.
I think it might have also, but probably not to the same extent as the 26th of March Supreme Court judgment with regard to Lee.
Thank you very much. Next question, Benjamin Engel. Hi, Ben. Question for Professor Mobrand. How do you juxtapose Yoon's seemingly anachronistic martial law declaration reminiscent of Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan butting up against the Constitutional Court's ruling, which was definitely grounded in the language of post-democratization Korea? Is this an opportunity to move beyond the past, or has Yoon reopened the Pandora's box? That's a packed question.
That's a really tough question. I mean, I think then let me say this. I'm somebody who wrote before Yoon was elected, and just after that he and those around him represent a profoundly anti-democratic force in South Korea's politics. But I meant that, I think, in the way that Professor Engel means, kind of toward the end of his point, that he and his colleagues had found ways within a formal democratic setting to undermine popular voices, to undermine democratic processes in order to preserve their own agenda. That has been what he and those around him and those he represents has worked hard to do. By declaring martial law, he blew that up. And I think this is the kind of the first time since Korea became democratic that we have been in this situation where the boundaries of democracy have been so directly challenged. And I think partly what is disturbing about this episode is not only that initial declaration of martial law, but those moments of hesitation, those moments where other parts of the People's Power Party hesitated instead of immediately, consistently condemning the action. We had, during the Park Geun-hye impeachment episode, there was an understanding we deal with this problem first, and then we get into electoral politics. The problem of dealing with the problem at hand and then getting into the next presidential election, these were treated as two sequentially separate problems. This time around, the PPP allowed these to muddy. They blended into each other, and so we had folks like Han Dong-hoon thinking ahead, what's going to happen electorally if Yoon is impeached, instead of going through the proper procedures of dealing with the challenge to democracy first. So I think this is a real challenge. The hope is, of course, today that we've drawn a line under it.
Just a very quick follow-up question about what Ben mentioned as Pandora's box in relations to past military regimes. The informal authority of the military commanders, of the army retired generals in the cabinet, that the authority that they wielded upon the commanders in the military. How should South Korea resolve this? What kind of problems did you see with this whole instruction and saying yes to that in the military, basically?
So I do not have all of the insight to give the best answer to this. I'll just say one thing, which is more general about the military in this episode, and I think that large parts of the military seem to have acted highly responsibly during the whole martial law attempt. One can only imagine empathetically the sort of pressure that people were under. And to get this sort of order to intervene this way would be a nightmare, a traumatic nightmare. So that sort of general statement is probably the only thing I can say to that.
If I may add to that, one of the reasons why this self-coup failed, and self-coups rarely fail without spilling blood on the streets, is because Yoon did not have full command of the military. He never even served He never even served in the military himself. Didn't do the compulsory military service. Was exempted, and the court actually pointed out, and Jeongmin, you referred to this in your introduction, that the reason why the the martial law didn't succeed is because of the passive compliance by the military, but they also criticized very severely the fact that Yoon pitted the military and the police, who are supposed to be protecting the people. You know, they're the only legitimate authority that can use state force. And the purpose has to be to protect the people and their basic rights. And the fact that Yoon pitted them against the people and used them as tools of his illegal martial law obviously is unconstitutional, and it gravely compromised and infringed the political neutrality that the military is supposed to observe and comply with. And so some commentators were actually saying that this constitutional judgment is going to be like a Magna Carta for the military, because since the last martial law, and given our past military authoritarian government history, it has been very careful that our military really stays politically neutral, and Yoon really compromised that. But thankfully, there were, as you say, military leaders who behaved admirably under very pressurized circumstances. And so, whether this is going to empower the military in that respect, I don't think so. But certainly, Yoon weaponized the public prosecution office, and that's a separate story.
Thank you very much. We can come back to that later. From Josephine Rasmussen, project manager at the Institute for Security and Development Policy's Korea Center. How do you think the political culture in South Korea is going to evolve going forward? Do you see impeachment becoming a mere tool used for political maneuvers? Because the DP is right now trying to get the now Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok and Prime Minister Han Duck-soo again. Could this be an indication to this? Anyone who wishes to answer this question?
Then I can start, and then, or yeah,
I'll
say something.
Start.
Yeah, okay, I'll say something first. I think I would be cautious to ascribe any particular actions as being an outgrowth of a particular political culture. I think it is important when we look at many things in South Korea's politics and many aspects of this episode. Responsibility for what happened, both positive and negative, lies with discrete individuals and groups, and some large groups. And I think recognizing that it is particular individuals and groups that have taken these actions is important, and not seeing these as a reflection of some broader norm. There is no norm that says it's okay to launch an auto coup. This was a strange action by a very small set of individuals. We've had other actions that were extremely impressive by larger groups, such as the immediate popular response to the declaration of martial law. So many ordinary Koreans knew exactly what they were supposed to do, and it was that knowledge that exists in society that drove that part of society to do that. The National Assembly, the opposition in the National Assembly, knew exactly what they were supposed to do and responded right away. That is not a diffuse characteristic of a fully shared national political culture. It has to do with a particular set of people. And so I think when we look at particular tools of politics and of law, we need to keep that in mind. I think Professor Zhou's earlier point about the politicization of the prosecutorial authority becomes very relevant with this question. This is an issue over the duration of Yoon's administration. And really, this is actually how he launched his political career, by politicizing judicial institutions. Maybe I can hand it back over to her.
Professor Cho?
So I don't think impeachment is necessarily going to be a tool for political maneuvers, because it's actually a very inefficient and time-consuming, and you can lose a lot of political capital if it goes wrong. And I think DP was really pressed to use this as a last resort, because if you look at it, impeachment was used with regard to appointees who are really entirely inappropriate for their posts. Yoon was notorious for, appointing people to, for example, who were supposed to uphold human rights, and they had absolutely nothing to do with human rights. He appointed people to the financial authority who had no experience in finance whatsoever. He appointed someone as the Broadcasting Commission chief, who completely undermined independence of public broadcasters, and so on and so forth. And so in those high-level public offices, you really have no easy way of removing those officials, because their independence is supposed to be guaranteed so that they can do their jobs without interference from, higher up, like the president. And when Yoon is basically being nepotistic and appointing entirely inappropriate and unqualified people to those posts, what do? Do you just sit back and say, well, there's nothing we can do? Plus, I think Ms. Rasmussen gave this specific example of the two acting presidents, Choi Sang-mok and Han Duck-soo, and they are in fact members of the State Council or the cabinet who were participating in the authorization and the planning, well, not necessarily the planning, but certainly in the execution of the self-coup on that night in December. And there were some talks, in fact, at the beginning to actually impeach the whole lot of them, who were actively supporting, or at least not opposing Yoon in executing that. So I don't think that impeachment is necessarily going to be a political tool that's going to be used willy-nilly, but there is certainly some reforms that need to be made within our political institutions when it comes to appointments and removal of unqualified people.
Thank you very much. Next question is also about impeachment. Let's just answer maybe very quickly. From Bree Blackstone, what did you think of the court's decision relating to Han Duck-soo's impeachment? Blackstone believes that some legal reasoning of the conservative justices were dubious in some regards. Do you believe that the court reinstated Han because it knew already that they would impeach Yoon? I think this is for Professor Cho.
Yeah, I am afraid so. And I haven't read the full judgment yet. I've only read the summaries, but there are huge questions that I would ask, particularly with regard to the some of the conservative justices, because basically what the judgment said is that, yes, Han Duck-soo has infringed constitutional principles, but he didn't really do that much damage. And, Chair came along later and he appointed two of the justices to the Constitutional Court. And, what Han did wasn't that bad, so it's okay. And he should have been given more time to carry out, what he was supposed to do. And the National Assembly was too hasty in moving the motion to impeach Han. But there is really no, guideline or real sort of legal principle to justify the reasoning that was given that actually said, yeah, it's a bit like saying she was only a little bit pregnant. you know. So when you are infringing constitutional principles, you are infringing constitutional principles. And the argument was, well, it wasn't that serious. But actually, you know, leaving the Constitutional Court bench vacant, 3 seats out of 9, to the extent that they can't actually make a proper ruling in very important cases, is a serious breach. And so it's very difficult to accept. And the only rationale that I could come up with was that this was essentially a kind of a, not a quid pro quo, but it was another accommodation of the conservative justices on the bench ahead of the really big decision that was to come, which is Yoon's impeachment case.
Something we could probably expect from forthcoming memoirs from some of the justices potentially in the future.
Possibly.
Yeah. To both of you, what is your take of the institutional weaknesses that was revealed? Just after the martial law, Yoon's approval number plummeted to almost below 10%, and support for impeachment was high as 75%. But once corruption investigation of his CIO started investigating Yoon, with jurisdiction issues exposed, conservatives started to rally around Yoon very quickly. It looks like multiple procedural issues and the delay in deliberation have added confusion and undermined the faith in institution. We did touch on this a little bit, but let me ask this question to you, Professor Mobrand.
I think institutions can be very difficult to reform and adjust. Constitutional revision has been extremely difficult. Even minor constitutional change has been extremely difficult in the South Korean context. So I think we can look for grounds for positive thinking if we change the way we look at this a little bit. One of the great positives from this whole episode was the response from ordinary citizens. And I think the immediate response those first few weeks in December, that was perhaps more powerful than any constitutional separation of powers. There was something constitutional in the action of ordinary people coming out into the street around a set of symbols, invoking particular memories that everybody knows exactly what they mean, right? You just put down a few words, put down a year here and there, referring to some past protest against dictatorship. People know exactly what it means. There's nothing radical in this. There's nothing destabilizing in this. There's nothing violent in this. In South Korea, we have a constitution that is hard for, I think, a lot of ordinary people to feel is very close to their hearts. It's hard to tell a magical, charismatic story about Korea's constitution. That's not the history that we got in this post-colonial place. But people come onto the streets, and that puts a little bit of magic, I think, into the public order. And it also checks elite power in a way that really matters. And so I think that is something that is, first of all, fascinating, and second of all, gives us some real hope for democracy in the country.
That is very uplifting. Thank you. We are running out of time a little bit. We have to wrap up in around 3 to 4 minutes. So let's do a lightning round session, answering just very quickly to some of the questions. From Mr. Francisco Gonzalez, everyone expected Yoon to be very knowledgeable of the legal rules and procedures of the courts, being as he was a prominent lawyer and prosecutor. The opposite turned out to be true. His actions and defense looked clumsy, even naive. What would you attribute this to?
No, not at all. He used every trick in the book to bolster his defense and, escape, essentially impose his will for as long as possible and on as many things as possible. And so we are much more wise with regard to what a criminal defendant can do to escape, questioning, investigation, etc., etc., etc. But I think he was really living in his own world and a kind of believing what he wanted to believe, and there was nobody really to kind of tell him, look, you are just dreaming, you are in a world of your own making, and you really need to wake up and smell the coffee and realize what's going on. I think there was no real true advisor around him that's kind of telling him, oh, even he did have that, he just wouldn't take it. And so I think it was really sort of Yoon's own fault that he wasn't able to come to grips with reality.
Every trick in the books, it sort of included his whole focus on the intention and his perception of what he thought was national security threat and all that. There is actually a pushback from one of the audiences to Professor Cho. The question says, impeachment is not a tool to filter out unqualified officials, but to punish them for gross misconduct. In this regard, don't you think a series of impeachment motions by DP was an excess?
Oh, certainly, some of them were too hasty. For example, with regard to the Broadcasting Commission, she didn't have enough time in the job to, commit major breaches, but she certainly would have. But for other officials, I would beg to differ. They certainly committed major abuses of office that's merited being removed from the office.
Thank you. Professor Mobrand, next question. How sustainable is the political legitimacy of the conservative bloc, PPP, after impeachment? And do they require yet another overhaul, like a change of name or personnel, etc.? If so, how likely is that such reforms will align with public sentiment? And does the bloc possess the ethical foundation necessary to carry them out effectively? This is quite long for a lightning round, but please try to answer this quickly.
As Professor Jo mentioned, after Park Geun-hye's removal in 2017, her party was really destroyed, and with Yoon and particularly his work to obstruct reform of the prosecutorial authority, they rose a little bit from the ashes. Then, as I mentioned earlier, he went on to embrace the extremism that other elements in his party had attempted, partially successfully, to normalize. That formula for getting mass support is now hurt, and so we'll see what happens next. Maybe there will be other figures will continue to play up the anti-woman rhetoric and try to put some extremist views in young male voters. Maybe they'll come up with something more creative. I think the hope could be maybe they will. And maybe it's idealistic. Maybe another party will try to make conflict be about something else. But right now, they are, in terms of getting mass support, in a difficult position.
Thank you. I think the next question is for Professor Cho. As regards criminal proceedings against Yoon, can he be liable on the ground of abuse of power now, in addition to insurrection charges, that he has no longer presidential immunities, or his actions are still protected by presidential immunities because they were made during his mandate?
Exactly. Now that he's removed from the office, the presidential immunity is lifted, and he will have to face a whole host of criminal charges, including abuse of office, there's corruption charges, bribery charges, election offenses, a litany of criminal charges await him.
I have a lot of questions incoming on, but I'm very mindful of everybody's time. So I have screen captured all the remaining questions for everybody, and I will try to get both professors' answers for our audience in the next few days via email. But my last question that I planned on is actually asked by Kieran McCrae. I hope I pronounced it right. For both of you, there's a lot of talk of reform right now in South Korea. What reform should we focus on? If you could advocate for just one reform, what would it be?
May I go first?
Yes, please.
So there are a number of institutions that are fundamental to our society where powers are too concentrated. And so I think the most urgent reforms that are needed with regard to those institutions. And so the particular ones that come to mind are the presidential office, the public prosecution office, and even the court. And we have seen vulnerabilities in these particular institutions, especially through the experience that we had in the past few months. And attempts have been made to reform this, particularly with regard to the public prosecution office under the last administration, but it was only not even half complete, not even quarter complete. It was kind of begun and sort of, went nowhere really. And so introducing diversity and weakening this concentration of power, I think, is the most urgent reform that's necessary. In my mind, democratic institutions should be like plumbing. They should be quiet but running. Always they might need attending to from time to time, but it shouldn't be that an ordinary citizen has to come out to the street every time a crisis like this happens. Public institutions should be essentially acting as a watchdog, and there should be checks and balances that are working in the society, so that not every single time that the people have to come out and bring order back to chaos.
That was a beautiful quote, and I'm very tempted to use it somewhere for a headline. Professor Mobrand, what's one reform that you would choose?
I think it's not really up to me. It's up to Korean voters what sort of reform is the priority. But if I were to say something, I think it is relevant to remember the historical context of South Korean state and society today. We have a state that was set up for very particular historic purposes of national security, of making war and defending the country, of assisting industrialization, of undertaking ridiculously large infrastructure projects, building stuff. Those are the things that the South Korean state has abundance of in its inheritance. That's what it's been good at. The task of doing other things that ordinary citizens want a democratic state to do while facing the challenges that we all face in the 21st century of dealing with regulation, dealing with environmental problems, dealing with fairness, addressing diversity, incorporating pluralism, all of these kinds of things, it's not historically set up to do. So it is a major task. It is a major task to undertake reform. It's very easy for someone like Yoon to run the country when you have a very limited set of things that you want to do, when you're not trying to undo this old system. And so reform is a very difficult task. If I were to make a list, I would also say keep going with the reform of the prosecutorial authority and secondarily courts.
Thank you. Really, one last question related to this. This is less about your preference, but about a prediction. Will there be a constitutional reform?
Oh, absolutely, no doubt.
In the next few years?
Yep.
Yeah. Eric?
I think it's going to be very difficult. I think it has been difficult every time for all the wrong reasons. It's been difficult to reform or abolish the national security law. It's been difficult to make even minor reforms to the Constitution. I think it is going to be difficult. There will be a lot of unfair criticism coming from biased media outlets and other sources. There will be real challenge, but there is an opportunity there. So let me go back to Professor Jo's optimism.
All right, so let me take this.
My prediction is that next general election, the people will actually return the current opposition party back to National Assembly with two-thirds majority, so that they can undertake, or at least the Democratic Party plus other minor parties, so that they can undertake constitutional reform.
Then let's revisit with the same panelist to revisit this bet in a couple of years, and let's see what came true. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. We're so sorry for the initial technical glitch, but everybody joined at the end. And I see some of the questions related to security, like what might inter-Korean relations impact might be if Lee Jae-myung is the next president. On NK News site, our sister website, we are covering this very in-depth, so I recommend visiting that for our latest analysis. Thank you very much, Professor Cho and Professor Mobrand. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in.
If you want to know more, sign up for our daily executive briefings. We brief you on all you need to know from the past 24 hours and why they matter every morning in your inboxes.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for your weekly dose of insight. And until next time, I'm Jeongmin Kim.
And I'm John Lay. Stay connected, stay informed, and we'll see you next time on the Korea Pro Podcast.